Most people, when they hear the word vampire, imagine creatures from novels and screens, fangs in the night, bats against the moon. But history disagrees. Folklore disagrees. For centuries, the vampire was not a story. It was reality. As real as the cold soil underfoot, as undeniable as the grass above a grave. There were vampire frenzies, hunts mass panics where whole villages dug into their cemeteries. European royals accused, their courts shaken by whispers of blood. Government officials traveling hundreds of miles to investigate a phantom that no one dared dismiss. And yet, the vampires they feared, the ones they claimed to see, did not resemble our familiar monsters. They did not bite necks. They did not sprout wings. The truth is stranger. The truth belongs to another world. Eastern Europe, folklore, where memory and soil fuse. Erase what you know. Begin with silence. Begin with a blank canvas. For what we will uncover is older, rougher, truer. We ask, what did the vampire look like? How did it move among the living? What rituals bound and destroyed it? And why has its shape changed so far from its origin? To answer, we must return to the beginning, to the word itself. To chase the vampire, we must chase the word. And here the ground grows uncertain, for vampire is no simple invention. Scholars tell us many roots, some tangled in Slavic soil, others whispering from Iran, from ancient rites of darkness. The Russian upir, the Serbo-Croatian vampire, words shaped like graves, consonants as hard as stone. There are whispers of an old god, Baum, who carved a tomb of shadow. In Slavonic tongues, Vam is darkness, Pir is a drinking bout. Together, a drinker of the grave, a banquet of silence. But another line of thought pulls us elsewhere, to Latin, impurus, the unclean, a corpse, a revenant. And yes, that feels closer. For these creatures were not spirits, not demons, not fairy tales. They were bodies, flesh that rose when flesh should not. Across Bulgaria, Russia, Poland, the name mutates, vapir, upir, upor, always the same breath of unease. And often their lore overlaps with the lore of wolves, werewolves and vampires sharing the same birth, the same curse. In Serbia, both carried one name, Vukadlak. Even the Greeks borrowed, Vrikalakas, a revenant that once walked Slavic hills before it was given a Greek tongue. And in English, the word appears in the 1730s, a fragile echo, but an echo powerful enough to remain. Its origin, unknowable, a stew of tongues and fears. Perhaps that is the truest essence of the vampire, a creature that bends, changes, never fixed. But before we step further, let us pause. Vampires are not only European, they have lived in Chinese shadow, in Indian forest, in South American dusk. To speak of them all would take a lifetime. So tonight, we narrow our gaze, not out of dismissal, but out of necessity. For it is the European vampire, swollen, blood-dark, feared in the graveyard, that haunts our culture still. The hunger for blood, the dread of the grave, these are older than any one land. From Lilith, the first demoness, said to drink the blood of children, to the Romans, whispering that the northern tribes consumed blood beneath moonlit pines, to Beowulf's Grendel, red-mouthed in slaughter. But none of these are vampires in earnest, not yet. The first true shape forms in the 14th century. Serbia, villagers exhuming the bodies of their neighbors, burning them, scattering ash on the soil. 3 centuries before the word vampire ever walked into English, the people already feared them. Stefan Dusan, Emperor of Serbia. When graves are disturbed, when bodies are drawn out and burned by magic means, the village shall pay a fine, and the priest who joined in such rites shall be stripped of his station. A law, written in ink, proof that the belief had already spread like fire. Why this belief? Why did peasants in their grief, in their hunger, imagine the dead rising to torment them? Look closer. Epidemics sweep through the land. Pestilence moves from house to house. Crops fail, children die. Disease has no name. The world has no science. And so, the answer is simple. The dead themselves must be to blame. The corpse that lies in the ground, it must be feeding, must be breathing, must be spreading the invisible poison. Thus, when sickness spread, graves were opened, bodies were burned. Vampires were not stories. They were explanations. They were a map for terror. Do not ask why they believed. That question belongs to us, with our science, our proofs. For them, it was enough that there was no proof to the contrary, enough that death came and kept coming. So they made sense of it the only way they could. And from this soil, the vampire walked. The vampire remained a whisper, a curse of villages, until the 1700s. Then, one man's death brought it into Europe's heart. His name was Arnold Paole, a soldier, Serbian. He returned from war with a story, that in Turkish lands he had been tormented by a vampire. To protect himself, he said, he ate earth from its grave. He smeared his skin with its blood. He swore this to anyone who would listen. Years later, in 1726, Paole fell from his wagon. His neck broke. He died. But death did not silence him. Villagers claimed Paole still walked among them. They said he attacked cattle, that those who ate the meat soon sickened, soon died. 17 gone in 3 days. One girl, Stana, spoke of a dead hand throttling her in her sleep. She died on the 3rd day of her affliction. The villagers dug Paole up. What they found chilled them deeper than the grave. His body is fresh. His nails had grown. His veins were full of liquid blood, red at the lips, seeping from eyes and ears. They drove a stake into his heart. He groaned. Blood poured. They burned him. Ashes scattered on his grave. But it did not end. 14 more corpses were exhumed. All showed the same signs. Undecayed, swollen, dark with blood. All were burned. So, it was determined the outbreak was vampirism. The report spread. A magazine in Europe printed it, and the whisper of vampires crossed borders. Another case followed. A body in a Serbian village said to rise, strangle, infect. And here, the word vampiri appears. A new name, sharpened by fear. Soon, obsession seized Europe. By 1732, books, poems, and dissertations flooded the presses. Vienna, Paris, Amsterdam. Whispers said a princess had risen from her tomb, that Louis XV drank the blood of children, riots burned, 20 dead in Paris streets. Then silence, the sound of a clock ticking. This was the golden age of the vampire, at once superstition, science, and hysteria. A creature both mocked and feared, and with each outbreak, Europe's thinkers raced to explain. Opium, datura, poisoned meat, bad soil, rats in coffins, mass hysteria. Yet even as emperors declared vampires a delusion, the fear had already rooted deep. For the grave still held mysteries, and the dead still did not rest. What did a vampire look like? Not the pale count of films, not the elegant predator of novels. The vampire of the people was found not in castles, but in the grave. When suspicion rose, graves were opened, bodies examined, and always the signs were the same, not pale, but dark. Flesh darker than life, sometimes black, sometimes blue. Lips stained red. In Yugoslavia, they said the vampire's face was flushed, like an alcoholic's, drunk on blood. In Serbia, corpses were described as swollen, grotesque, their skin stretched tight like drums. One Greek text declared, "It is an infallible sign of a vampire when the body does not decompose, but swells, the skin taut as leather." Blood, too, marked them, liquid where it should have clotted, found in the mouth, at the ears. When staked, the body groaned and bled, as though still alive. They said nails grew back, that new skin pushed through, the old sloughed away, that the liver inside was pale, white as wax. But notice, teeth are absent. The sharpened fangs of cinema did not exist. That invention came later. In Russia, vampires are pierced with sharpened tongues. Elsewhere, they were strangled, tore, sliced. Modern science has since walked these same graveyards. What peasants saw was not sorcery, but decay. Darkened skin, the blood starved of oxygen, the body discolored. New skin, the epidermis slipping, revealing flesh beneath. Nails, not growing, but the flesh receding, leaving them longer. Bloated torsos, gas. Decomposition filling cavities with pressure until the belly swelled. blood at the lips, the seepage of disease, the regurgitation of fluids. Even the pale liver speaks, cirrhosis, too much to drink. The veins strangled, the color changed. They did not know this, could not. To them, these were not signs of nature, but of the unnatural. And so each open coffin became proof, each body a revelation. The vampire, after all, was not imagined in the shadows. He was found on the earth. What did the vampire do once it rose? Today, stories make them lords of the night, calculating, immortal, driven by hunger or ambition. But folklore is quieter, stranger. The old vampire was mindless, catatonic, a body compelled, not a soul choosing. It did not speak except to groan. It did not fight except when struck. It was instinct, not malice. Most of its time was spent in its grave. It rose only to feed, and even then, not always. Some Slavs swore they could drink only on Saturdays. And daylight? That weakness belongs to modern tales. In folklore, the sun held no power. Yes, it drank blood, but not delicately at the neck. In Russia, it bites at the chest. In Romania, near the heart. In Poland, the breast. Its touch was not elegant, but brutal. Theories have surfaced. Diseases like porphyria, said to cause sunlight sting, or gums receding to reveal long teeth. But these match not the folklore, only the fictions. A dangerous confusion. Blood was not its only feast. Livestock were found mangled. Sometimes human flesh is torn. In truth, wolves and wild dogs did the work. But to grieving eyes, it was the vampire. They said it shifted shape, into wolves, into dogs, but never bats. That was an invention born centuries later in stories, inspired not by Europe, but by South America's vampire bat. And more. They said vampires fed on corpses, clawed from shallow graves. But this too had reason. In times of war, plague, famine, burials were hurried, graves shallow, earth thin. Animals dug where men could not. The power of the vampire is great. He kills in life. He spreads sickness, storms, hail. He casts spells on cows and crops. He knows all secrets, even the future. He becomes invisible. He becomes an animal. He becomes anything. A list without end, a creature without limit. But this too speaks. For in truth, the vampire was not only a body, it was an answer. When crops failed, when storms came, when disease spread, the vampire explained. They were witches before witches, a name for calamity, a shape for fear. Wherever disaster struck, the vampire followed. Today the rule is simple. A vampire bites, and you become what bites you. But in folklore, the paths to the grave's hunger were many, and not all chosen. Yes, being bitten could doom you. To die at a vampire's touch was to rise again in its likeness. But that was only one door among many. In Greece, a troublesome man, quarrelsome, ill-tempered, might be cursed in death to walk again. In Bulgaria, thieves, highwaymen, and arsonists, those who lived as outcasts, were fated to return restless. Alcoholics were prime suspects. In Russia, their corpses were unearthed first when plague struck. Suicide too brought suspicion. And sorcery. To die, a witch was to rise as a vampire. Children bore marks as well. Born with teeth, said the Poles, they would one day return, a split lip, an extra nipple, a vestigial tail, all omens of the undead. Even animals could decide fate. In Romania, if a black hen flew over a corpse, the grave could never rest. Elsewhere, it was other beasts, each land naming its own. But most haunting were those who died unfulfilled, alone, forgotten, buried in haste without priest or ritual. Victims of plague, shunned, their bodies lowered without care. Soldiers fallen in battle, without funeral. Mothers whose children were left unclaimed. In Greece, such souls became vrikolakas. In Serbia, to die unwitnessed was enough. In Finland, a neglected corpse was fated to rise. See the pattern. War, famine, disease, deaths without ceremony, graves unguarded. These were the makings of vampires, not only curse, but consequence. And in this way, the belief fed itself. For when burials were rushed, decomposition was strange, grotesque, and misunderstood. and each strange body unearthed was proof that the vampire lived. The vampire was born not from one wound, not one rule, but from neglect, sorrow, unfinished lives. And so, the land filled with them. To survive the vampire, the living turned to prevention. To bury wisely was to bar the grave from rising. And so, funerary rites became weapons. Some said the undead were driven by a hunger to chew. To stop them, earth was shoved into the mouth, or shards of pottery, or books, torn and broken. Among Western Slavs, bricks wedged between teeth, so that if jaws moved, they shattered. Others gave them food, meat, bread, wine. Let the corpse eat quietly in its coffin rather than roam for flesh. In Prussia, a candle was placed, so the spirit might follow its flame to heaven. In Pomerania, the mouth was filled with poppy seeds, the body lulled by sedatives of the grave. Knots too were weapons. Many believed a vampire, if it rose, would be compelled to untie every rope, every tangle. So, bodies were bound with nets, ropes, twisted cords. A prison of threads, a trap of patience. And yet, there were harsher customs. Sickle blades placed across corpses to cut the swelling belly. Stakes driven through the heart. Knives buried with the dead. In Romania, sharpened sticks thrust into the ground above graves, waiting like thorns for the body should it rise. The living, too, armed themselves. Garlic was a shield. So was mustard seed, cow dung, even human waste smeared on doors. Some wore the blood of the vampire itself, smeared on clothes, on flesh. In Pomerania, they mixed it with brandy and drank. In truth, men likely drank the blood of vampires more often than vampires ever drank the blood of men. Crosses marked homes, carved in wood, traced in tar. In Serbia, a cross above a door was enough to keep the revenant out. Or, more simply, the creature could be sent away, led into the forest, left to feed on animals until it vanished, or until the animals destroyed it. But if none of this worked, if the vampire rose and walked, then it fell to the hunt. To hunt a vampire, first you had to find it. When plague struck, the rule was simple. Look to the first who died, dig them up. If the body resisted decay, the guilty was revealed. But not all outbreaks were so clear. Sometimes whole cemeteries were turned over. Corpses pulled from the soil, one by one, until the swollen, darkened, blood-wet body was found. That one was staked. That one was burned. There were other signs. A horse led through a graveyard. In Albania, the horse must be black. In other lands, white or pale. When it refused to cross a grave, that was the vampire's bed. A tilted cross, a sunken mound, disturbed earth. All hints of a body restless. Some said a grave glowed blue, even flickered with flame. Science tells us this may be gas, light, catching strange air. But, to old eyes, it was fire from within. And invisibility. Yes, some swore the vampire could not be seen, except by twins born on a Saturday with their clothes turned inside out, or by dogs snarling at shadows. Though in other villages, silence of dogs was proof the vampire had come. A shovel strikes earth, then bone, then the crack of wood as a coffin opens. Once found, killing was called mercy. The vampire, they said, did not wish to walk. Death was a gift. Stakes were most famous, ash in the north, oak in Poland, hawthorn in Serbia. But knives worked, shovels, swords, nails. Anything that killed a man killed a vampire. Fire was surer still, though costly. Bodies burned to ash, the smoke choking the village air. Yet wood was precious, fat scarce. Cremation was a last resort. Sometimes even cutting the body into pieces was not enough. The flesh still resisted flame. In Russia, corpses were drowned in rivers, water swallowing their curse. In Albania, too, water held the soul, dangerous but binding. And sometimes the cure was simple soil. In later centuries, they said a vampire must rest in the earth of its homeland. Remove it, replace it, and the revenant could not rise. But this rule is modern, born from story, not folklore. Yes, decapitation too. The head severed, buried apart, far from the body. And with each strike, with each ritual, the living believed they had won peace. But the fear remained, for graves were endless, and the earth was full. For centuries, the vampire was earthbound, swollen corpses, groans from the grave. But then came stories, and stories, unlike graves, are immortal. The greatest of them, Bram Stoker's Dracula, a book that reshaped the Revenant into something elegant. No longer the blue, bloated corpse, but a count, a lord of shadows, a creature of intellect and charm. With Stoker, the vampire stepped into castles, into ballrooms, into candlelit chambers. He became an aristocrat, feeding not only on blood, but on fear, on desire. Cinema followed, Nosferatu, Dracula, countless others, and with each telling, the vampire shed another piece of folklore. Fangs sharpened, cloaks unfurled, bats took wing, daylight became death. Garlic, crosses, mirrors, some pulled from old belief, some invented whole. Yet beneath the fiction, the old truths linger. The vampire as explanation for famine, plague, disaster. The vampire as scapegoat for what could not be named. Science tells us the rest. Decomposition mistaken for hunger. Disease mistaken for curse. Hysteria mistaken for hauntings. And still the vampire endures. Not as a corpse, not as peasant terror, but as a symbol. For he is ever malleable, ever changing. A creature born of fear itself. So when you picture him now, the pale face, the gleaming teeth, the dark cloak, remember, beneath that mask lies the swollen body in the coffin, the gas-filled chest, the blackened flesh, the dripping blood. Remember that once they dug into graves and swore the dead moaned when pierced. Remember that once the vampire was not a story, but fact. And ask yourself, when the earth stirs, when a shadow passes the window, when breath catches at your throat in the silence of night, was it only a story, or was it history waiting to awaken?